what happened after the movie. There's the movie and then there's Touchstone. There's two separate things. And this is a film class, so I want to honor that. And I'd like to just say a couple of things about objectivity. I think the film, as a documentary, is extremely well done. And as you pointed out, the editing and the meshing with the music communicated something that isn't communicated through, let's say, articulated through words, but there's a message communicated. As objectivity, as now modern physics tells us, may not exist, particularly in the realm of experimentation, where the example that is constantly given is that if you're observing something, you're affecting it. But the corollary is also true. If you're observing something, it's affecting you. So that objectivity is something that if you're going to do a documentary, you probably want to put out a message anyway. So that is one thing as filmmaking, but also as film watching. Watching the film is also kinetic. You're being drawn in to the spiritual realm, because that's what the subject matter is. It's about establishing a spiritual community or a spiritual center, and then all these questions arise. Is there one religion taught? Or is it a cult? Is it a community? And what the film seemed to do was project its place within the community, and how spirit is different from religion. And this is a very important point in the spiritual movement that arose in the 1960s and that continues today. Spirituality is different from religion. Spirituality is a connection from the collective, with the collective, and the individual to the collective, that comes through the heart and comes through the, it's irrational, but it's the glue that connects people to the higher parts of their being. That's general. So that what Touchstone was about was people would come to Touchstone and feel and be moved by this spirit. Their hearts would open. They would connect with other people and they would be transformed. Shaker, or Shakur, which would more properly, a lot of his spirituality was based in Sufism, which is an Islamic tradition, but also in pagan traditions, or the reverence for the earth being sacred. And a lot of what he represented was the spiritual vision of removing yourself from the society. As Rowan said in the film, her quote from Krishnamurti, if you are adjusted to a sick society, you're not healthy. So adjustment to what is dysfunctional is not a healthy process, and that's the state of our culture today. As nice as you all are as people, you are products of a diseased culture. It's a decadent culture. And this is evidenced by our pop culture and by our forms. What Touchstone attempts to do is take itself out of the culture and establish a spiritual community where everything is loving and everything is beautiful and people are transformed. That, to a certain extent, is an illusion, because even Touchstone is a product of a culture. In this case, you see Shaker, myself, and others who are products of the 60s and the revolutionary thinking of the time. And one of the key things that I think is about the film that is not, the film cannot bring out, because it doesn't go through the transition. It stops at the transition. And what you had in the case of the Renaissance community, commune, Professor Geisler was part of, I believe, and this, and is the dynamic, the organic dynamic, and the key word is organic. Everything is organic. The organic dynamic of starting something that is one thing and then it turning into its opposite. And what that is about is like Woodstock. Think Woodstock and Altamont. Think Touchstone, and now what is there is a shell, and it's dead for all intents and purposes. But that's organic. Something is born organically in spiritual or irrational terms, not through logic. We're going to start something and build it and crank, you know, and crank up and build empire. But when you try to do something like they did, but connect to the organic and the spirit, it has a life cycle, and it grows and it peaks and then it dies. But the key in this movie for me is that when the building inspectors came in and they put their big foot of society and broke down that shell, that bubble, and society entered and said, we're closing you down. We're closing you down. Well, that's physically what they did, but psychically what happened is they put it in the context of materialism and money, but they also brought it into the modern world. Echo Village is totally different from Touchstone Farm and Yoga Center. Touchstone Farm and Yoga Center is of the 60s. Echo Village is of the 90s and the new millennium. So they brought it into a different frame, but what is not said or seen ever is the unconscious. You all, as I said, are products of a society, and you put on the outward trappings of normal people. But within you is a shadow part, what C.G. Jung called the unconscious. And within those elements, we carry all of the dark, ugly stuff of society. And at some point, as C.G. Jung said, as Carl Jung said, that what is not made conscious will appear in our life as fate. What is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. And along with that, in terms of a visionary leader of a group, if a visionary leader is given a persona of leader and he channels the collective psyche through him, and Shaker's genius was to be able to make everything relate to spirit and be the alchemist of transformation. And if something happens to that visionary leader, then everything around him, you see it in the manifestation of the building, what has been built. And the myth that's key here, that I see as key here, is the myth of the Holy Grail. Because what Touchstone was about was searching for that Holy Grail, that spiritual awakening outside the ugliness of society. And Shaker could be likened to King Arthur, who, lying on his bed now, is wounded. And as he's wounded, his whole kingdom falls apart. And this is the underlying foundation of what has happened since the finishing of the movie and what we see now. And in a sense, it's all a teaching, and it's all about what spirituality is really about. And spirituality is not about feeling fuzzy and warm inside. It is about growth. And as beings, part of that is warm and loving and expansive and connecting. But the human psyche has a dark, dark element. And when you layer on top of that the darkness of a decadent society, and you draw on that as what happened, I believe, at some point, that the paradigms of the material world began to rule Touchstone and express what it was, and that inverts things, and you have an imbalance where there was balance, and you have decay. The reason I'm getting into all this abstract stuff is I was asked to try to give you a metaphysical background, which, as a documentary, it captures it in its own way. It is a documentary of a cultural vision that started in the 60s and is still relevant as the collective or the cooperative and movement is an organic movement, and the respect for the earth and the idea of intentional community is still relevant, because the world or the outside community still tends to be really brutal and harsh. But what it teaches us is that we're not separate. Touchstone is not separate, or when you try to start a little community. And that's the value of this film, or what the value of an additional film. But the value of this film is, even without saying these things, they're said in subtle ways. A shaker throws out, and others throw out different bits of wisdom that sort of were the psychic and spiritual context of what people believe. And it is also, a lot of it comes from Western and Eastern mysticism. So as modern students, you all think, or everyone thinks as modern people, we're separate from that. But this is the dynamic that is eternal. Another myth that is embodied in what's going on now at Touchstone, or not myth, but a play from the 5th century, 4th century BC, by Euripides. It's called the Bacchae, in which it features the cult of Dionysus, which was a cult that drove people mad. It is a cult based around the religion of madness, where women were the Bacchae, and they would run off through the woods and tear animals apart with their bare teeth and kill their sons, and to free themselves. And this was the madness of Dionysus. We live in an era in which that madness is America, the madness of Dionysus. And how it touches Touchstone, Euripides says in the beginning of the Bacchae, when the gods seek to destroy a people, they first drive them mad. And that's the theme of the Bacchae, and that's, I believe, the contemporary dynamic that we find in our society today, and Touchstone is not excluded from that. So that's all I wanted to say. If there's any questions.
Questions for others? Anybody?
How long have you been a member of Touchstone?
How long have I been with Touchstone? I met Shaker, I was never living there, but I was a presence there. We were friends and peers since 1986, when he first came to the Valley. I was living on 100 acres in West Hampton, and I had met him before, and he came up to our land to get saplings to build a sweat lodge. And I took part in, and he brought Native American healers from the Lakota reservation out to Touchstone, and they did sweat lodges and healings there for better part of a year and a half or so, and I took part in a lot of that, and then the planting ceremonies, and just being his friend and watching him construct out of trash, mostly saunas and buildings and greenhouses, and we had many philosophical discussions. And then I took part in the sacred dance, and much of the life. Most of the people in that film I know. I mean, they're either my friends or acquaintances. That's my community. And to watch this film, I get choked up. It rips me right apart. It's my history, and these people are my brothers and sisters. And yet I'm objective enough about my own life and my own psyche. I'm not different from Shaker. I'm not different from any of them. It's our collective that, in some sense, manifests everything that was there: the beauty and the decadence and its eventual illness. Yes.
Is there any sort of effort to try and make a new Touchstone, or to try and bring everyone together? There
was, and there has been, and because of the way spirit works, you don't know. It could be a phoenix rising from the ashes. I believe that spirit is always working on some level, And I did a healing ceremony earlier this year with the folks from Indigo Massage, where we walked the perimeter and to clear negative energy, and we brought prayers but it doesn't look good. It doesn't really look good. The world is crashing in with foreclosures and lawyers and all that stuff that tend to not be part of the death of an organic process.
I have a question. Go ahead.
Are there any efforts to maybe branch out of Touchstone and maybe make another one somewhere else, or?
Are there any efforts to start one somewhere? Well, Touchstone was part of a network of sacred dance around the world, but what was interesting in this story was when Shaker told the story about the building inspector coming and saying you could get $625,000 right now, and it'll cost you a lot. There was discussion among Shaker and Anya at that time as to whether to take the money and run and establish a Touchstone up in a place outside of the environment of East Hampton. Therefore, actually breaking one of the tenets, which was to live in the world and be part of the community, and to do what a lot of groups do is just buy some land someplace and to keep everybody out. And in looking back, as an organic process, as Anya sort of foretold, she had the thought that maybe we're not supposed to be here anymore. And this is what's difficult about spirit, and what is amazing about the people that did live the spiritual life. And as Dave can attest, things happen and you have to trust, you have to open up to faith. Well, at that point, they could have had faith, and it's always hard when you have to accept that death might be what life is bringing you, to go on to something new. And if they did, they may have established Touchstone somewhere else, but as it turned out, it became sacrificed to the forces of decay and destruction, which is a story in itself. There's as documentary filmmakers, the reason I'm giving you all of this is that there are always mythic themes, no matter what you're documenting. There's always the drama, because we're talking about human beings. There's always a drama that is irrational, but yet coming from unseen forces within the culture, within the psyche, that you may capture on film and not know where it comes from. And as a materialist in our training, you might say, oh, well, this was a result of A, B, and C, but often there's no explanation. And I think in the transition that Shaker made, it seems to me there isn't an obvious explanation, and it made me and others search for, which makes you look inside. It's always that internal work, but that's another topic. Yes.
One of the pitfalls for a lot of spiritually oriented intentional communities is, especially with charismatic people at the center, is that they become cults in the negative sense of a cult, the pejorative sense. I didn't get the sense at all through the course of David's film that there were any cultish aspects to Touchstone Center. Do you agree with that? And if so, what is it about the two charismatic figures at the center, Anya and Shakur, that made it different than I'm in the middle of a big study that I'm doing about cults, religious cults and spiritual cults for the last 40 years. What's different? What was different?
Wow, the question, many the spiritual visionary create cults, and the sense was that there wasn't that at Touchstone, and what was is it about Shaker and Anya? Wow, I would say I'm a cult person at my core. And from the 60s, I sought out cults and joined enough of them in my life. Touchstone bordered on cult in the sense that the rhetoric and the spiritual rhetoric of cult is there. What was genuine about Anya and Shaker is that they had done the work on themselves, or appeared to have done the work on themselves, so they were actually in touch with something spiritual rather than as a cult with something dogmatic and combined with charisma. And cults often are dogma and a charismatic leader. And here the practice was spiritual, and the result wasn't leading a dogmatic existence. It was opening the heart, and the results were in the transformation in the individuals, and everyone wasn't resident there. It was a larger community that came to experience something that was beyond words. So the beyond words aspect of it, and the freedom and liberation of everyone to be part of their own life and to live their own life, prevented that what the trap or the pitfall of many cults, which is you're living in as a group, you're set off from society, and you develop this dynamic of antagonism and a narrowness in your thought. It was quite the opposite. It was more or less intentionally to be part of the community and based in true spiritual principles, but nothing dogmatic. It was more organic. Again, it was just organic. And if you needed answers, you didn't go to the spiritual leader necessarily. Everyone was their own, or you went to the earth, or you conjured the spirit through sacred dance, and then you meditated and dwelt in that for your answers, for your internal space, rather than externally seeking it from a charismatic leader.
Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up this portion? Thank you very much, Ellie.
Welcome.